Welcome back to Read Aloud Time. This is Miss Hovis. We're going to be reading chapters 5 through 8 of Serafina and the Splintered Heart. Chapter 5. Serafina followed the path through the darkened forest at a quick pace, down into the ravine dense with ancient maple and hemlock trees. Her legs felt strong and steady beneath her as she weaved between the great trunks of the forest's oldest inhabitants. A chorus of tree frogs, peepers, and insects filled her ears, and the scents of primrose and moonflower wafted past her nose. The evening flowers stayed closed during the day, but opened with their sweet smells at night. Everything seemed unusually vibrant to her tonight, like her body and her senses were alive with new sensations. The forest grew thick with rosebay rhododendron bushes glimmering in the silver moonlight. Hummingbird moths hovered over the white and pinkish blooms, dipping into the recesses of the flowers and sipping out the nectar within. It almost felt as if she could hear the beat of the moth's wings against the night air. Fireflies floated in the darkness above the shiny green leaves of the laurel. Soft flashes of lightning danced on the silver-clouded sky behind them, and a gentle thunder rolled through the darkness, moving on the rising heat of what felt like a summer breeze. "This is all so strange," she said to herself, looking around her in confusion as she traveled. The last night she remembered it had been winter, but the air felt strangely warm now, and these plants and insects didn't come out in the winter. Had the magic of the Angel's Glade somehow extended out into the rest of the forest? When she glanced up at the moon, what she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. The moon was not all the way full, but large and bright, with the light on the right and the shadow on the left. "That's not right," she said, frowning. That night she was on the loggia, the moon had been full, which meant what she was seeing now was impossible. She knew that the moon was only full one night a month. Then it would wane for 14 nights, with the light on the left side getting smaller and smaller until it was dark for a single evening. Then it would wax for 14 nights with the light on the right until it was full once more. Then it would start all over again. The moon was the great calendar in the sky by which she had marked the nights of her life. Wandering through the grounds of Biltmore estate by herself, the steady phases of her pale companion, the slow sweep of the glistening stars, and the curving transit of the 5 brightest planets had been her silent but loyal confidants for as long as she could remember. They were her midnight brothers and her dark morning sisters. She had spoken to them, learned from them, watched them as a girl sees the members of her family moving around her. But tonight she looked at her sister the moon in confusion, a thumping urgency in her temples as she tried to figure out the meaning of what she was seeing. The moon was lit on the right side. That meant it was waxing, getting larger each night. But if the moon had been full the last time she saw it, how could it be waxing now? It was as if she had fallen backward a night in time. Either that or something equally unimaginable. She had been underground for more than an entire cycle of the moon. "That means 28 nights have passed, maybe more," she said to herself in astonishment. The breeze whispered through the tops of the trees as if hidden spirits of the forest were nervously discussing that she had discovered the universe's ruse. Time flew forward, time flew back. Nothing was as it seemed. People were buried underground, and people came back. She was in a world of many in-betweens. Another set of flashes lit up the sky and danced silently among the clouds. Then the thunder rolled on, echoing across the mountainsides. She had always been able to see things other people could not, especially in the dark of night. But tonight there seemed to be a special magic in the forest. It felt as if she could actually see the evening flowers slowly opening their petals to the moon, and the glint of the starlight on the iridescent wings of the insects. She felt the caress of the air as it slipped through the branches of the trees around her body and against her skin. She sensed the stony firmness of the earth and the rock on which she stood. The tiny droplets of dew on the clover leaves around her suddenly glistened, and a moment later the white light of the distant lightning shone in her eyes. Water and earth and light and sky. It was as if she had become intermingled with the faintest elements of the world, as if she were in tune with the slip and sway of the nocturnal realm in a way she had never been before. She continued walking, but as she gazed through the trees, she spotted what appeared to be a crease of blackness in the distance. She tilted her head in confusion. Was it a shadow? She couldn't make it out. But as she narrowed her eyes to look at it, she realized that whatever it was moving. Not toward her or away, but hovering in the air, like a rippling black wave. The skin on her arm rose up with goosebumps. She couldn't help but wonder if what she was seeing was related to the black shape that had attacked her at Biltmore. She knew she should leave it alone, but she was too curious to run away. She slowly moved closer until she was maybe a dozen steps from it. Then she stopped and studied the black shape. It appeared to be about 5 feet long, floating of its own accord a few feet off the ground, like a long banner held in the breeze. And it was utterly black, blacker than anything she had ever seen. Suddenly, a wind swept through the trees. A gust kicked up from the forest floor, swirling small tornadoes of leaves around her. The branches hanging above her began to creak and bend, like the swaying limbs of old, twisted men, their long, twiggy hands dangling down onto her head and shoulders. When the cold mist of the coming rain touched her face, she realized that a storm was near, and then she spotted a dark figure making its way toward her through the trees. Serafina sucked in a breath in surprise and dropped to the ground to hide. She scrambled beneath the base of a half-toppled tree where the spidering roots had pulled up from the earth and created a small cave. Pressing herself as deep as she could go, she peered out through the small holes between the roots. The man, or creature, or whatever it was, moved toward her through the forest with a slow and deliberate pace, like a predator hunting for prey. It stalked on 2 long, gangly legs, its back hunched over and its head hanging down, its shoulders swaying one way then the other as it gazed from side to side. Even as hunched as it was, the creature was very tall, with long, crooked arms dangling in front of it like a praying mantis, and elongated fingers with its spindling hands like white, scaly talons tipped with sharp, curving, claw-like fingernails. It moved with a steady purpose, scraping its feet through the leaves of the forest floor. The movement of its bones sounded like cracking branches. What kind of God-forsaken thing is that, she thought, cowering in her hole. Is it some kind of vile creature that crawled from the grave the same way I did? The creature came closer and closer. As it stepped within a few feet of her, Serafina couldn't keep her body from trembling. Her only hope was that the creature wouldn't see her hiding beneath the roots at its feet. She could hear its breathing now, the slow, wheezing, ragged, hissing breath, like a wounded animal, and she could see it more closely than she had before. A white haze lingered about its body, like the smoke around a dying campfire, and straggly gray strands hung around its head, like the stringy hair of a rotting corpse. When the creature turned, she saw its face. She gasped. The creature's face had been slashed with a savage wound that oozed with a blackish, festering blood of an injury that had never healed. She couldn't tell whether the creature was a mortal man or a hellish fiend, or some combination of the two, but its sharp, pointy teeth chattered with anticipation as it scanned the forest, swaying its head back and forth as it creeped forward with its dangling claws. At first, it seemed as if the creature was going to pass her by, but then the thing stopped, standing right over her. Its talon-like hands grasped one of the roots of the toppled tree beneath which she was hiding. Serafina sucked in a startled breath and held it, too frightened to exhale. The creature looked one way into the forest, and then the other. It seemed like it knew she was there, that it sensed her presence, maybe could smell her, but it had not yet detected exactly where she was. She held her breath like a trembling rabbit in her little den. The creature opened its mouth and a low, vibrating, guttural sound emerged. Then Serafina began to actually see the white air rushing from its lungs. It wasn't just an exhalation or a long scream, but a storm. The air around her began to twist and turn, the leaves swirling up the branches on the trees bending and cracking. The air exploded with blowing rain. The terrible noise coming from the creature's mouth was getting louder and louder as the storm rose up all around. The storm creature peered down into the mound of roots where she was hiding. Its silver glowing eyes looked straight at her, shocking her with a blast of fear. The creature's talons closed into a fist, crushing the roots that it had been holding. Then it began tearing the roots away with both hands, its teeth chattering as it ripped its way towards her. Chapter 6. As the creature attacked, Serafina reflexively tried to shift into panther form to defend herself, but it didn't work. For some clumsy reason, she couldn't change. She tried again, concentrating on envisioning herself as a panther, but she couldn't do it. She remained in her human form, not knowing what else to do. She cowered down. She tried to stay out of the creature's reach as it ripped the roots away. She thought about leaping up at the thing and fighting it with her bare hands, but it seemed far too powerful. At the last second, just as its claws touched her, she scrambled out of the roots on her belly and darted out the other side. A storm raged through the forest. The pelting rain roared around her. The wind blew so hard that her hair and clothes pressed against her face and body. It felt like it wasn't going to just blow her away, but tear her into little pieces. But she couldn't let the storm slow her down. The creature was right behind her. She had to get out of there. She ran headlong into the swirling rain and just kept running. When she looked over her shoulder, she expected to see the creature charging up behind her, grabbing for her, but it wasn't. It was in the distance, still ripping at the roots where she'd been hiding. Confused but relieved she'd managed to escape the wretched thing, she quickly turned to keep moving. But she nearly ran straight into an eerie black shape, similar to what she'd seen before. She stopped abruptly, recoiling from it like it was a venomous snake. It floated right in front of her now, so sharply black that it seemed like an impossibility. The light of the moon and the stars disappeared into it, and she could see nothing on the other side of it. Rain fell, but it did not come out. It was like a tear in the fabric of the world. The sight of it tightened her chest. Her skin buzzed. She backed away and ducked into a thicket of bushes to hide. When the black shape drifted in her direction, she caught her breath in surprise. She couldn't tell if it was drifting on the wind of the storm or was actually drawn to her in some way. The roiling black shape floated slowly closer. She thought that the thick foliage would protect her, but the leaves and branches snapped and hissed as the black shape touched them, bursting them one by one as it moved towards her. She frantically squirmed away, but the edge of the black shape touched her shoulder. The searing pain felt like she was being slashed with a burning white-hot blade. She screamed in agony and wrenched herself away. Driven by blind fear, she clambered out of the thicket and ran. She spotted a rocky area and sprinted for it. When she saw the drop-off of a steep mountain slope, she jumped. She hit the ground hard and rolled down the earthen slope, her shoulders and legs thudding against the rocks and trees as she fell, then sprang to her feet and fled. She tore through the forest, gasping for breath, but pushed herself on, looking over her shoulder for signs of the storm creature and the black shapes. As the rain and wind slowly died down and the storm faded behind her, she kept going at a hurried pace. Finally, she was relieved to see the glow of the moon peeking through the clouds. Dayfolk knew that the sun rose in the east and set in the west, but many didn't realize that the moon did as well. Its black shadows among the trees were like arrows pointing the way home. As soon as she got her wits about her, she figured out what direction she needed to go and went as fast as she could. She had to warn the people of Biltmore about what she had just seen. But just as she began to make progress, she came to the edge of a river blocking her path. She scanned the surrounding area in confusion. "Don't tell me you've gone and gotten yourself lost," she scolded herself. She had thought she was close to home. She remembered a creek near here, small and shallow, just a quick leap across. But what blocked her path was now a powerful river, turbulent and strong, ripping through the trees. Its shores weren't the rocky edge of a normal river, but the flooded forest. It was strange how much had changed. If the little creek she remembered was now this churning river, then there must have been many other storms like the one she'd just fought her way through. A knot of worry bunched in her stomach. There were few things in the mountains more powerful and dangerous than the rushing waters that had formed them. Knowing she had to get home, she stepped into the dark water of the river to cross it. The current felt like tiny shards tearing at her bare skin. She'd waded across plenty of rivers, but this was a strange and alarming sensation that she'd never felt before. When she took another step, it became very clear that the river was far too deep and turbulent for her to cross. It seemed like it wanted to suck her in and pull her under. Looking out across the river, she was amazed to see an entire tree, branches, trunks, root, and all, floating downstream, tumbling through the current like a great leafy leviathan. Many of the largest and oldest trees at the edge of the river had toppled into the current, the earth beneath their roots ripped away by the powerful pull of the rushing water. She stepped back out of the flooded river and away from the edge, convinced that the dark, malevolent water wanted to consume her. She couldn't cross here, but if she was anywhere near where she thought she was, there were no roads or bridges for quite a while. "We're in a real pickle now, girl," she said, talking to herself the way her pa did. "What are we going to do about it? That's the question." Then she had an idea. She made her way upstream along the shore until she found one of the tallest trees hanging over the river, its great spreading boughs almost reaching across and touching the trees on the other side. She knew the relentless current tearing at its roots would soon bring the tree crashing down into the river, but for now, it was her path. She climbed up the trunk and then outward on the limbs, high up over the river's tumbling flow, moving from branch to branch, her goal to cross the river the way she'd seen squirrels do it, using the canopy of the trees as her bridge. But as she crawled further out, the tree's branches became slender green saplings, bending and whipping in the wind. It felt like the wind was going to sweep her away. Every muscle in her body clenched as she bobbed and swayed in the upper branches. She could see the closest tree on the other side, a great pine with sturdy branches thick with needles. But she couldn't leap across such a great distance. It was just too far. Looking down, all she could see 100 feet below her were the swirling black water of the river. If she lost her grip here and tried to jump to the tree on the other side, then she'd go plummeting down. She'd either die when she hit the water, or she'd get swept away in the current and drown. One way or another, the river would have her, just like it wanted. As she was trying to figure out what to do, she heard a stick break on the forest floor down below her. Back in the direction from which she had come, she swiveled, scanning the forest for danger. Had the storm creature followed her scent and tracked her here? But then she spotted a robed figure moving slowly through the trees. "What kind of devil spawn is coming now?" she thought in exasperation. "I just want to get home." She squinted her eyes and peered down through the branches of the trees, trying to make out who or what was down there. It was a man wearing long robes. A hood of some sort covered his head, like one of the old Celtic druids from the ancient Britain that she'd seen depicted in Mr. Vanderbilt's books. As he made his way through the forest, the robed man opened a pale and delicate hand in front of him. Suddenly, a glowing, hissing torch of blue light, like a tiny ball of lightning, rose up from his palm and hovered over his shoulder, lighting his way through the darkness. Some kind of sorcerer, Serafina thought as she crouched lower. Her heart began to pound in her chest. The storm creature, the floating black shapes, the storms, they were all his doing. Everything she had seen must have been the sorcerer's conjurations. Had it been the sorcerer who attacked her on the Logia? Had he already taken over Biltmore? She had to get home. But how? She was stuck up in a tree 100 feet above a raging river. When the dark-robed sorcerer stopped walking, the hair on the back of Serafina's neck stood on end. Her whole body began to shake. Every sense inside of her was telling her to fight or flee. Flee, her mind kept telling her, flee before it's too late. The sorcerer slowly lifted his head and looked up into the trees in her direction. Chapter 7. Serafina scurried for cover, pushing herself farther out onto the thinner branches of the tree, even as they bent and twisted in the wind, lifting her and dropping her in sudden movements that made her stomach feel like it was floating. She scanned the branches on the opposite side of the river. A moment before, it had been too far to jump, but her muscles were bursting now, her whole body filled with panic. She focused her eyes on the branch she had to jump to, tilting her head to study the angle, then leapt for it with a mighty grunt. As she flew through the air, she envisioned herself as the Black Panther deep inside her soul and tried to shift into her shape. She could see the panther form clearly in her mind. This was the moment. She was in midair. She had to do it now. But the shift didn't come. She reached out desperately with her thin human arms as she sailed through the air, trying to grab hold of the branches of the pine tree on the other side. She felt her hands touch the branches. She grabbed hold. She had made the distance, but her body swung too hard and she immediately lost her grip and continued to fall. Her arms flailed, reached out in all directions as she tried to catch hold of something, anything on the way down. She slammed into a thick branch. It knocked the wind out of her with a powerful crack. She twisted around and frantically tried to hold on to the branch, but couldn't. She fell again, hit the branch below, reached out, fell, grabbed, fell, slipped again, reached out, slipped, then grabbed hold with an infuriated snarl and finally held fast. She found herself clinging to the bough of a pine tree some 50 feet lower than where she'd started. Her arms and legs were scratched and bleeding. The long, curving spine of her back, usually so supple and strong, hurt something fierce. Grabbing at the hard branches on the way down had jammed her measly human fingernails painfully into her fingers. Frightened to make any more racket than she already had, and still wincing from the pain of the crashing fall, she gritted her teeth and quickly crawled into the cover of the pine tree's inner branches and hid. She peered out from her hiding spot, sure that the sorcerer must have heard her. She expected to see him staring up at her, or casting a spell, or summoning one of the black shapes to finish her off. Instead, the smoking, hissing blue ball of burning light came toward her, floating up into the trees, illuminating everything around it in a bright halo, as the sorcerer looked on from below. Serafina cowered into her hiding spot in the thick cluster of pine needles as the eerie blue light came closer. The buzzing, burning light smelled like a lightning storm and made her hair float up around her head. But she stayed hidden where she was, her skin tingling. Finally, the light floated on, and the sorcerer continued his journey through the forest. Serafina let out a deep sigh of relief and started breathing again. She watched as the sorcerer made his way through the ferns that grew along the edges of the river. He leaned down and pulled some sort of plant from the ground, then moved on. Suddenly, Serafina noticed something out of the corner of her eye, something moving much closer to her. Snapping her head toward it, she saw a large, silvery spider web glistening in the starlight, and its 8-legged spinner lurking on the outer edge, with its many eyes watching her. The spider moved. As the spider moved, tiny droplets of dew on the web shimmered in the light, some jostling loose and falling to the forest floor, but others moving like quicksilver along the strands. Serafina knew that it was impossible, but she swore she could not just see it, but hear the droplets sliding along the strands of the web. She could actually feel them skirting along like a shudder down her spine. Startled, she climbed away from the spider's web and looked back down into the forest. The druid sorcerer, or whatever he was, had gone down onto his knees now, the burning blue orb hovering over him like a lantern, giving him light to work. Excuse me. He dug through the boggy area at the edge of the river, gathering the tall, pitcher-shaped, carnivorous plants that grew there. Just as she was about to creep away, the sorcerer spoke. He did not stop his work or look around. He didn't speak in a deep and frightening man's voice like she expected, but a surprisingly soft, calm, steady tone. It was as if Serafina wasn't hidden in a tree 100 feet away, but concealed in the bushes beside the hooded figure. "I can't see you, but I know you're there," the voice said. Chapter 8. Serafina burst out of her hiding spot and fled. She leapt from branch to branch down through the tree. As soon as she hit the ground, she ran, her bare feet thrashing quickly across the forest floor. When she looked over her shoulder, she didn't see any sign of the sorcerer, but kept running. Putting the dark river behind her, she fled way up into the rocks and trees of a high ridge, then through a wide forested valley. When she finally slowed down, she could tell by the type and age of the trees that she was getting closer. She could see a soft glow of light in the distance, and it drew her home like a beacon. As she made her way along the edge of Biltmore's bass pond, she noticed the little stream that normally trickled into it was swollen with rain, filling the pond with more water than usual. "The storms are coming," Serafina thought. The calm, flat water of the pond reflected the light of the stars and the moon, but she didn't linger to admire it. She was anxious to get home, to make sure Braden and her pa were all right, and to warn them about what she'd seen in the forest. She followed the garden path up through the pink and orange azaleas, which were blooming as bright as the moon itself. When she saw a faint green glow up the hill toward the rest of the gardens, she paused, uncertain. She knew Biltmore's gardens well, but had never seen a greenish light like this before. Her first thought was that the sorcerer had already been here, had already taken over and made Biltmore his domain. Then she heard the murmur of many voices. As she approached more closely, she saw the green glow wasn't a sorcerer's spell, but the conservatory all lit up for an evening party. The light shining through the leaves of thousands of orchids, bromelates, and palms, and through the greenhouse's many panes of glass. She crept along the edge of the building and looked into the walled garden. There she saw hundreds of ladies in formal summer dresses and gentlemen in black tailcoats gathered for the party. The windows of Biltmore House blazed above, the south walls and the towers of the mansion rising like an enchanted castle into the night. The walled garden had been strung with the kind of softly glowing Edison bulbs that her pa used, and smaller lights hung along the wooden arbor that covered the central path of the garden. The lights tucked among the leafy vines and flowering blooms like fairies taking refuge among the leaves. She had never seen so many beautiful lights in her life. Hiding in the bushes near the rosekeeper's stone shed, she scanned the crowd for Braden, but she didn't see him. He was a reserved boy, not always the center of attention, but his aunt and uncle usually encouraged him to attend the estate's social events. She and Braden had shared so many adventures, and they had been through so much together. He was her closest and most trusted friend. She couldn't wait to see him. The fancy folk were mingling about on the perfectly manicured paths of the garden, holding champagne flutes in their elegant, flawless hands, chatting and sipping lightly as they promenaded among the roses, dahlias, and zinnias. Bathed in the conservatory's glow, a string quartet played a beautiful song. Footmen in their formal black and white liveries strolled among the crowds, serving custard tarts, cheeses, and freshly baked cream puffs from their trays. Serafina suddenly felt a pang of hunger. But everything about this party flummoxed her. It must have taken weeks of planning to arrange all of this, and yet she hadn't heard anything about it. And why wasn't Braden here? There were so many strangers. Where were Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt? A few of the more adventurous adult guests, and a coterie of their fanciful attired children huddled together and lit candles inside small paper lanterns, then held them aloft. As if by magic, the rising heat of the candles lifted the lanterns upward out of their hands and into the nighttime sky. Serafina watched with the other children as the lanterns floated slowly up into the heavens. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of it, but then a sadness swept through her. She knew that it was foolish after everything she'd been through, but she felt so sad that she hadn't been invited to this wonderful party. It was an evening party, and she was a creature of the night. If anyone should have been a part of it, she should have been. It felt like so much had changed, like the whole world had been slipping by without her. After destroying the Black Cloak and freeing the estate's lost children from its dark imprisonment, she had entered the daylight world upstairs. The Vanderbilts welcomed her into their home. She had become part of Biltmore now, hadn't she? So why wasn't she at this party? It made her qualmish in her stomach to think about it. What had happened? What had she missed? Hadn't anyone noticed that she wasn't there? It was hard to understand how all the fancy-dressed people could gather for this lovely party when just a few miles away a storm had raged through the forest. A short distance down the hill, the inlet stream was quietly flooding the pond. A dark force was coming, but they seemed to have no idea. When she heard Mrs. Vanderbilt's gentle laugh in the distance, Serafina turned hopefully toward the sound. She saw right away that Braden wasn't there, but Mr. Vanderbilt and Mrs. Vanderbilt were standing together with several of their guests near one of the rose trellises. Mr. Vanderbilt was easily recognizable with his black hair and mustache and his lean, shrewd face with dark, inquisitive eyes. He was dressed in a handsome black tux with tails and a white tie. Many of the men she had spied on over the years were loud of voice and boisterous of manner, but Mr. Vanderbilt was a quieter, more refined, thinking kind of gentleman. Unusually, if he wasn't reading in his library, he was watching and learning from those around him. He was always kind and welcoming in spirit when he spoke to people, whether they were his guests or servants or workers on the estate. But he also seemed to enjoy watching people at a distance at parties, taking everything in. Mrs. Vanderbilt was more outgoing, more talkative and social with the guests. She had dark hair like her husband and a similar spark of intelligence, but she had an easy charm and a gracious smile. She wore a lovely, loosely flowing mauve dress. But what truly stunned Serafina was that Mrs. Vanderbilt's belly was large with her baby. The last time Serafina had seen her, she couldn't even tell that she was with child. It hasn't just been 28 days, Serafina thought. She felt as if she were being lowered into a deep, dark well. I've been gone for months. They've all forgotten about me. And where is that dear nephew of yours tonight? One of the lady guests asked Mrs. Vanderbilt. Yes, indeed, said the lady's husband. Where is young Master Braden? Oh, he's around, Mrs. Vanderbilt said lightly, but Serafina noticed that the mistress of the house didn't actually look around when she said these words. It was as if she already knew her nephew wasn't nearby. She was acting cheerful in front of her guests, but Serafina could hear the twinge of concern in her voice. As Mrs. Vanderbilt and her friends continued their conversation, Mr. Vanderbilt stepped back from them and looked up toward the library terrace. Serafina could see the wrinkles of worry around his eyes and mouth. So how has Braden been doing? One of the guests asked Mrs. Vanderbilt. Oh, he's fine, Mrs. Vanderbilt said. He's fine, he's doing well. One he's fine was enough, Serafina thought, but two was too many. There was definitely something wrong. If you'll excuse me for a moment, Mr. Vanderbilt said. He touched his wife's arm and then left them. As Mr. Vanderbilt walked quickly through the crowd, several people tried to talk to him, for he was the host of the grand party, but he kindly gave his regards and kept moving. Ducking through the hedges, Serafina followed him. After being away for months, the sight of her was no doubt going to startle him. But as soon as he was alone, she was going to tell him about the dangers she'd seen in the forest. She could show him the rising water of the pond as evidence of it all. But she sensed the urgency in his movement. Mr. Vanderbilt ascended the steps through the walled garden's arched stone entrance and up the next set of steps to the path through the shrub garden. Serafina darted through the roses and then weaved behind the fruit trees to follow him. Careful to avoid the detection of guests, she had lost her ability to shift shape, but she certainly hadn't lost her knack for sneaking unseen or unheard. She was as fast and light on her feet as she had always been. She followed Mr. Vanderbilt up past the purple-leafed beech and then the elm tree with its low, swaying branches until he went up the steps and reached the pergola. Wine, sir, a footman said as he hurried down from the house toward the party with his tray restocked. "No, thank you, John," Mr. Vanderbilt said. "Do you happen to have a sweet tea on your tray?" "Oh, yes, sir, I do," the footman said in surprise, for iced tea was not his master's normal drink. Braden, Serafina thought. "Thank you very much, John," Mr. Vanderbilt said as he took the tea and kept moving. "Take good care of everyone." "I will, sir," John said, a worried twinge in his voice as he watched his master rush up the steps toward the terrace. Finally, the footman turned and continued on his way toward the party. As Serafina slipped behind a tree trunk to avoid the passing footman's notice, she couldn't help but wonder about how little people noticed the things around them. She knew that theoretically she could walk openly among the guests of the house, and she had felt left out about not being there. But the truth was, she still felt far more comfortable spying on a party than attending it. And the soaking wet, grave-dirty dress torn, blood-stained look of her would have shocked them all. Right now, she had her eyes fixed on one person, and that was Mr. Vanderbilt. Serafina went right after him. She ran across the gravel path, making barely a rustling step of noise, then bounded up the stone steps at the southeast corner of the house to reach the library terrace. It was a flat area just outside the glass doors of the library with a view to the forest and the Blue Ridge Mountains. The terrace was covered by an arbor heavily laden with long, hanging purple wisteria. The vines grew thick and twisty around the arbor's stout posts and up into its latticework above. The warm amber light of the library fell through the open doors onto the terrace. A boy was sitting on a bench, facing out toward the forest. When she first saw him, she didn't recognize him, but as she crept closer, she saw his face. She knew him. It was Braden. But what she saw, the way he was sitting, the look of his face, struck her such a blow that she couldn't help but suck in a gasp of air. She was too startled to move immediately toward him, like she normally would have. She watched from the shadows and tried to understand what he was seeing. The first thing she noticed was that Gideon, Braden's once beloved black Doberman, wasn't lying at his young master's feet like he normally did. The poor dog was lying 20 feet away, his head down, his ears drooped, a sad, dejected expression on his face, as if Braden had sent him away, scorned and unwanted. Braden sat on the bench alone. There was a plaid blanket laid around his legs, despite the fact that it wasn't cold outside. He was 12 years old, but he looked smaller, frailer than she had ever seen him before. His brown hair was longer, his skin different, paler, like he hadn't been outside as much as he usually was. But what caught her most of all was that there were long, jagged scars on the side of his face, and his right leg had been strapped to some sort of leather and metal brace with hinges at the knee. Her heart swelled with grief. She wanted to reach out to him. What had happened to Braden? Had the dark forces she'd seen in the forest already attacked him? "It's just me," Mr. Vanderbilt said softly as he approached his nephew. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Braden said, his voice somber. "I'm all right," but his words were laced with tones that tugged at her heart. Braden seemed so sad. His mouth hung grim, his eyes were dull of spirit, and as she crept closer to him, an even darker, more despairing expression clouded his face, as if something was suddenly causing him even more anguish than moments before. But she could see him trying to steady himself the best he could, at least for his uncle's sake. "Did you come all the way up here for me?" he said. "There wasn't anything to do down there," Mr. Vanderbilt said, smiling a little, and Braden gave him a wan, knowing smile in return. Mr. Vanderbilt offered him the glass of sweet tea. It had always been Braden's favorite, but as he reached out with his left hand to take the glass from him, his hand was shaking so badly that it was clear that he wouldn't be able to hold the tea without spilling it. "I don't want that," Braden snapped at his uncle, knocking the tea away. Mr. Vanderbilt stepped back and took a long breath. The master of Biltmore wasn't at all used to someone treating him like that, but after a moment he stepped closer once more. "Try it again," he said gently, handing the glass to Braden. "Your right hand works better, I think." Braden looked at him sharply, but slowly reached over with his right hand and took the glass. His right hand was trembling too, but not nearly as bad as the left. Steadying the glass of tea in two hands now, Braden took a long drink in silence. When he was done, he nodded. It was as if he had forgotten how much he liked the drink. "Thank you," he said to his uncle, almost sounding like his old cheerful self again, for a moment. But then he pressed his lips together and shook his head, barely holding back tears. Mr. Vanderbilt sat on the bench beside him. "Is it bad tonight?" Braden nodded. For the last few weeks, it finally felt like I was getting a little better, but all of a sudden, I feel so awful. "Is it the party?" Mr. Vanderbilt asked regretfully. "I don't think so," Braden said, shaking his head. "I don't know, maybe. Maybe it's the beautiful night, the moonlight, the stars. She loved nights like this." "I'm sorry," Mr. Vanderbilt said. "Sometimes I almost feel like I'm going to get back to normal again. But other times I feel a terrible aching inside, like she's standing right beside me." "I am, Braden," Serafina thought. "I'm here." But she was so transfixed by what she was seeing and hearing that she couldn't speak or move. It was like she was locked in a dream that she could only watch. "Sometimes," Mr. Vanderbilt said gently, "you have to push on through your life even when you don't feel too well. She might have left Biltmore for any number of reasons, but if the worst has happened, then we need to keep her in our hearts. She'll live on in your memories of her, and she'll live on in my heart as well. She was a good, brave girl, and I know she was a very special friend to you." Braden nodded, agreeing with everything his uncle was saying. But Serafina noticed a peculiar expression on Braden's face, a hesitation in his movement. Serafina knew him well enough to know that there was something he wasn't telling his uncle. Mr. Vanderbilt put his arm gently around his nephew. "No matter what's happened, we'll get through this." It was strangely fascinating to watch and listen, to imagine a world where she had disappeared. But Serafina couldn't stand it anymore. She had to tell them that she was alive and well, that she was finally home. And more than anything, she had to warn them. The talon-clawed creature, the black shapes, the storms, the dark river, the sorcerer, they were coming. Taking in a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the column and showed herself to both of them. "Braden, it's me."